Awkward intro. All right, guys. I'm here with I think one of my greatest friends. When I first moved to this church 4 years ago, first guy I prayed with, first everything in this church, really. Alex Kinney. He's the man, the myth, the legend. And essentially, we're going to talk about a couple things today, about following God's path in frustrating situations, when things go wrong, to always trust in God and whatnot. And it's gonna be a good time. If it's impacted you in any way, shape, or form, share it. If you know someone that needs this message, share it with them. And thank you. Alex, how you doing, brother?
Doing good, man. Glad to be here. Definitely a different way of presenting or talking about things that I've been thinking about, but I'm excited to be here and kind of look into the Word a bit this morning. So
that's good. Lately, we've been both, I guess, in this phase where we've been giving up our controllers to each other. If you don't know, through my few Instagram posts about playing Fortnite, Alex and I we used to play a crap ton of Fortnite, a little bit more than we probably should have, but what's come out of that is, I guess, more of a realization that we need to put our things away and begin to read more. I know, Alex, you're reading a couple books now.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I guess going back to that, for me, it's not that I think any of that kind of stuff is wrong. I think we need to have leisure activities in our life that are good, ways that we can kind of relax or wind down, whatever that is. People have different avenues that they do that, whether it's sports or reading or whatever it is. And I guess that's kind of the thing that we gravitated to the most. But, for me, I've yet to find a great balance. So if I can't find the right balance, I'm just not willing for it to be around me. So in its stead, I've been trying to replace that time with reading a bit more, not just the Bible, which obviously I am reading, but a couple other books as well, a couple business books that relate to work, but also a couple books with some spiritual emphasis in them as well. And just kind of diving into that. I've got probably 4 or 5 books on the go right now, which is probably the most I've ever had at any given moment in my life. So it's a unique situation, but it's kind of interesting. And the best part about it, I guess, is that when you're reading that many books, there's usually always something that you can turn to in that downtime or your relaxation time that you're actually going to be interested in that moment. So, maybe I'll go home tonight and I'm not really interested in reading outside of my Bible a book about spiritual emphasis, but I can read a business book, and that's kind of the avenue that I'm using lately with my downtime. So
that's good, man. What books are you reading right now?
Yeah, so one of them I just finished. It's called Good to Great by Jim Collins. It's a business book. It's really good. And also another one called 0 to 60 Million and Beyond. It's about the auto group in Texas called Texas Direct Auto. They were the largest eBay dealer in the world quite a few years ago when the internet was just kind of becoming popular. It's a bit of a thing in the past as far as eBay Motors is considered, but still some good context there. And then a couple spiritual books as well. One of them's called Desiring God by John Piper. I'm only a couple chapters into that. And I've also got a friend that I work with who has he's a Trinitarian, I guess, and so we've been having some great discussions lately. So right now I'm also reading a book that he gave me called The Forgotten Trinity, which I'm also reading side by side with the Oneness of God by David Bernard, to kind of sharpen up on that for myself and to have good conversations with him, not to argue, not to debate, which is not the purpose of it. But I just think it's really interesting that you can grow up in an apostolic church, firm and got a great foundation for what you believe in, but never really study it out for yourself. So I'm kind of taking advantage of this season of my life, I guess, where I've got that influence, and just trying to sharpen up on our doctrine and the oneness of God, and kind of study, I guess, his viewpoint as well, to see where he gets a lot of the things that he believes in. So
that's good, bro. So kind of getting into our main topic today, we're going to be talking about mostly staying in the confines of Genesis. We're going to be talking about Joseph, yes. I believe so. So kind of starting out in the beginning of Joseph's life when he's born and whatnot. And Alex, you kind of want to take the wheel?
Yeah, for sure. So I've just kind of been implementing a new study method for myself when I do read the Bible. I've been reading the King James Version, which is what I always read, but I also bought the Message Bible, which I read side by side, so it kind of gives it an interesting viewpoint, and also make sure that there's not any inaccuracies that you're reading about. Obviously, if there's pieces missing, you'll be able to gather it fairly quickly, as well as reading some commentary as well when I read in the Old Testament. So it's a lot. It's a bit overwhelming at times, but I guess for me, I think we've all been in the position before in our life where we just get into reading the Bible just to read it and not really gaining anything from it. Mm-hmm. So I'm really at this point going for the side of, it's more about the content that I'm gaining, mm-hmm. as opposed to how much I'm actually reading. So, I can read, with how I'm studying right now, 1 or 2 chapters, and by the time I've read it in the King James, the Message Bible, and then in the commentaries, what the commentaries have to say, it can take a solid half hour just to get through 2 chapters. So that's kind of what I've been doing lately, and started right from the beginning, Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, and right now I'm about halfway through Exodus. Also kind of started reading the beginning of Matthew a bit, trying to read the New Testament over the next month or 2. And it's good. I've been gaining a lot more insight from the Word, as opposed to just kind of reading my King James Version to check the boxes of what I'm supposed to do every day.
Yeah. And there was I think right now, even just talking from, I know I've texted you about my job and whatever, but there comes a point where you're making money and whatever, and then you realize, especially in this job where no one shows up, there's a place to literally do nothing in my job because I'm the only employee, but you kind of realize that you'll have all this money, and I'm not really doing anything with it. I just put it in my savings, but you realize that there's usually something missing. There is something missing, and then I'll be reading my Bible, kind of as you were saying, for the sake of reading it. But as I took a step back, and kind of one of the main reasons for this podcast is I've made a realization that it's when you really start studying the Word, and you start studying these stories that these characters take place in, you realize that you're really no different than any of them.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I think in the confines of the Bible, you grow up in Sunday school, and really when you're that young, they're hitting all the cool stories, the big stories. You think of, Jonah and the whale, you think of David and Goliath. And I think what happens is, because these are such, cool and crazy stories to a young person, is that we kind of lose the idea and the context that this isn't just a story about, fictitious characters, but this really happened in history. Mm-hmm. And, it's not a fictional book. This is the real Word of God, and this did happen. David and Goliath were real. Jonah was a real person. Mm-hmm. And I think it's pretty easy to lose sight of that sometimes when we're reading the Word. Yeah.
All right, let's dive in. You had some thoughts you wanted to share?
For Alex? Sure. Yeah. So, just this is kind of a new avenue for me to speak and to teach, I guess, so to speak. And just thinking about a good topic to cover, and we just kind of decided that we were going to talk about being in the will of God. And there's a couple pretty cool stories in Genesis. They're fairly well known, but when you kind of dive into them, you can kind of see how God was at work the whole time, even when the main character in the story didn't really realize it. So if you look in Genesis chapter 37, this is about Joseph, and it's kind of where the story really kicks off for him. It says, Genesis chapter 37 verse 1, it said, Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah and his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And so that kind of lays the foundation even for how Joseph was thought of by his other brethren. He was favored by his dad. If you've grown up in a household with siblings, your parents will never say that there's a favorite, but sometimes you feel like they might be playing favorites in the moment.
And the thing about children in the Bible is that when people name their children, it often determined the fate of their children. You have I forget his name. Every time I try to remember, I forget it, but his name was Phineas. I think he was one of the priests, the son of a priest, and then he had another brother, and they these two scumbags in the temple, taking the meat and the fat from all the people's sacrifices and whatnot. But his name meant like snake tongue or something like that, something awful, and he ended up being that. So like the way that they treated Joseph, you can already see that they were treating him like a hero from the get-go.
Absolutely. He was looked upon differently. And, we see through his two dreams how that kind of plays into how his brothers and the rest of his family perceived him. Genesis chapter 37, verse 5, it said, "And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaf stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. So they bowed down. And his brethren said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us, or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words." And then obviously there's a dream that comes right after that in Genesis chapter 37 about the sun, the moon, and the stars. It says, "He dreamed yet another dream, and told it his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. So they bowed down. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the same." So again, it kind of plays into the fact that his brothers were a little bit frustrated. First of all, they saw how Joseph was perceived by his father, how he was favored. And, to have these dreams that he was better than them obviously was a bit frustrating to them. Now, we don't ever really get the interpretation that Joseph was prideful or that Joseph knew that he was most favored. There's not really anything in the scripture that tells us anything of that nature. And so it's not like Joseph was going around bragging or toting or, showing off the coat of many colors even that his father gave him. We don't get that perception at all in the Word.
He probably even knew that his brothers hated him.
Absolutely.
Obviously.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
He was the youngest of quite a few brothers. And, maybe he felt like he had something to prove. But I think to have your father rebuke you in a dream that you tell him, and also your brothers hate you that much more all the time, I think that would make it pretty uncomfortable for Joseph, for his family to not be favoring him in those instances. So,
right.
It's amazing that even in Genesis chapter 37, the dreams that a young man had came to fulfillment in a way that he probably never would have thought along the way. And I guess that's kind of what we're talking about this morning. So, we don't have to read through the rest of the book of Genesis word by word and verse by verse to kind of know what happens here. We can kind of summarize the storyline on our own. We see that Joseph, he goes to kind of search for his brothers, and when he finds them, they see him coming afar off, it says, and they conspired against him to slay him, is what it says in Genesis chapter 37, verse 18. And they said one to another, Behold, this dreamer cometh. That's what verse 19 says. So they go after him, and obviously what they do is they fake his death. And now one thing that we actually don't mention very often when we talk about this passage of Scripture is Reuben in verse 22 of Genesis 37. It said, Reuben said unto them, Shed no blood, but cast him into the pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands to deliver him to his father again. So what actually was happening here, which you don't see it in the film that you've watched about Joseph or anything like that, is that Reuben actually had full intentions to save Joseph from what all the other brothers wanted to do. So obviously there was a bit of a peer pressure with his brothers. They wanted to, kill him, throw him into the pit, get rid of him, and fake his death, or show the father that he was killed by an animal, and lie to their father. But Reuben, his intention in verse 22, like we just said, he said, Shed no blood, but cast him into the pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him. And Reuben said that he might rid him out of their hands to deliver him to his father again. So he was hoping the brothers, would throw Joseph into the pit, and they would all leave, go back to doing what they were doing, tending the flocks, whatever. And Reuben was actually going to go back and save Joseph. But as the story kind of plays on, we realize that that's not what happened. They took his coat of many colors that was on him. They cast him into the pit. There was no water in it. They sat down to eat bread, so they're kind of just sitting around having some lunch. They lifted up their eyes as they're doing this. Again, Joseph's still in the pit, and a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down into Egypt. And Judah is the one who said, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh, and his brethren were content. So that kind of foiled the plan of Reuben. But what they did was they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites who were on their way to Egypt. And
that's the same. That's the parallel to when Jesus was sold.
Absolutely.
And it's the same thing, but it's like it's so much more awful because there is blood.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, and this isn't a fictitious story. This is something that really happened at a point in history. This was probably one of the greatest examples of sibling rivalry that there's ever been. So we kind of go on through the story. Joseph, he gets sold into Potiphar's house, becomes a slave there. But his life at that point is not summed up in what has happened. And Genesis chapter 39, you can pick it right back up there. He was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him out of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house and all that he had, and put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he made him an overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and he knew not aught he had save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. So even in this early stages of Joseph's life, you can see how the will of God is kind of playing out. And again, we don't even have any context to how Joseph is really acting in these situations. All that we really know is that he kind of doubled down on his situation. We don't find anywhere that he was whining and complaining or reflecting on his life about how his brothers and his families had kind of left him and deserted him and sold him into slavery. We don't get any of that from the word. What we do get is that Joseph, as frustrating as it might have been and as painful and as much as he might have laid his head down at night and missed his family and resented his brothers, whatever he was feeling, the Bible actually doesn't lay any of that out for us. But what we do know is that he just kind of put his head down and went to work. And because of that, the Lord blessed him, but not only blessed him, blessed his master Potiphar, where it really says that all that Potiphar had to worry about in the run of the day is what he was going to have for lunch, is basically what the word says. And Joseph took care of everything else for him. And then, we've got another pretty awful part of Joseph's life where he is tempted by his master's wife. Genesis chapter 39 verse 7 kind of picks it up. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused. And he said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is it with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he had to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me except for you, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And so we can understand through these scriptures that Joseph also respected Potiphar and knew that Potiphar had trusted him so much, and he refrained from that situation. But it wasn't just kind of a one-time event, which is something that we often, again, if you've watched the movie or whatever, that we kind of miss. It actually says, Genesis chapter 39, verse 10, and it came to pass as she spake to Joseph day by day. So this wasn't just a one-time event. She was chasing him repeatedly, and he kept on turning her down, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled, and he got him out, is what the word says. And so it wasn't just a one-time temptation where Joseph, resisted, but it was an ongoing thing where every day, Potiphar's wife was there tempting him, and he would reject her every single time. And obviously, she goes in, she steals his coat, and then she goes out, everybody around, and finds the men of the house and basically accuses Joseph of trying to rape her, which is not the instance at all. And that kind of puts Joseph back to square one again. He's actually thrown into prison in Egypt. So he goes again from being very highly favored in his father's house to being cast into the pit by his brothers, to kind of rising to the occasion again in Potiphar's house, only to be cast in prison once more. So history is kind of repeating itself in Joseph's life. We kind of go on. The butler and the baker, they're also there in prison with him. He interprets their dreams for them, and he says to the he says to the butler, he translates his dream for him and says, when you get back into Pharaoh's house, remember me. And then also translates the baker's dream to him about him being killed. And they both came to fruition. They both came to pass. Joseph was right. God had given him that gift to interpret dreams. And so, unfortunately, the butler forgot about Joseph in prison. I don't really know if we have an outline of exactly how long Joseph was in prison, but nonetheless, it was obviously not a great spot for him to be. But again, what we know that when he's in the prison, he actually becomes the the captain and the chief inside of the prison. So obviously there was a bit of leadership ability in Joseph's life that no matter where he went, he became highly favored, whether it was in his father's house, Potiphar's house, or even in the prison. So he made the best really out of every situation.
Even you have that section in the movie, although it is a movie, isn't it? He's like planting something.
Yeah, he's planting this tree, and
Yeah.
the tree grows and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean,
maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, but I think maybe the imagery is almost like he still brought life to a prison. You know what I mean?
absolutely.
Like possibly the worst place you want to be, he still made it good.
Absolutely.
He brought something out of it, and I think that's pretty incredible because he did that anyways. And I think it's because Joseph was a man who had respect for Potiphar. He didn't indulge in any sin. He just worked and worked and worked, and he had a respect for God, and he had a respect for whoever he was working for. And there's obviously this tension today for young people to always disrespect their authority and whatnot. Even in schools today, lots of the classes today, they're teaching that you shouldn't, like, I'm quoting this from one of my friends, but he's saying that some teachers are saying that you shouldn't even be like listening to your parents whatsoever because they have been taught tradition and whatnot. It's kind of crazy, but that's actually what's happening. And here you have a story of a man who's gone through the absolute worst, but still respects his authority.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the world that we live in today, unfortunately, doesn't promote, respect and reverence for parents for whatever reason. I don't know if it's a generational thing or whatnot, and this is really a large topic to talk about. But, we see a lot of young people from every walk of life. Really, it doesn't matter kind of what your culture is or what part of the world you live in, where kids or young people are rebuking the authority that's in their life, whether that be parents, whether that be teachers, whether that be whatever. That's kind of the world that we live in today, and it's not conducive whatsoever. That is totally anti-biblical. We are commissioned to honor thy father and thy mother. That's what we are supposed to do. That doesn't mean that we always agree with what they say or what they do. That's not what it means at all. But it means that in all of that, whether we do agree or disagree, that we honor and we respect them because, they brought us into this world. So
and it's like you need to like ask yourself is where would you be without someone to hold your hand or guide you or whatever? Like where would you be without the voice of your pastor? If you got in trouble like Joseph did, how would you act?
Absolutely.
Like what, like we were talking about it with the tree examples last Sunday. Alex taught a lesson about trees, and but it's like, what fruit do you bear? Like, and I believe that your authority teaches you how to act and how to express the love of God in the world. Like what like if you made an attempt to walk through this world on your own, how far would you get?
Yeah, absolutely.
Not very far.
Not very far at all. And I mean, obviously, with how Joseph acted in life, Jacob, his father, was obviously a great example to him in one way, shape, or form. Even though Joseph was favored by his father, we see that, we understand that because he was the son of his old age. That obviously didn't go to Joseph's head. And Jacob would have instilled a lot of the things that Joseph knew and how Joseph operated throughout his life. So obviously he respected authority, again, like you said, in every situation that he was in. The story kind of continues from there. As the butler gets out of prison, Joseph says, remember me, and he doesn't. But then Pharaoh has these two dreams, And, all of these people are brought before Pharaoh to interpret the dreams, and none of them can. And so in that moment, the butler says, hey, I remember somebody who interpreted a dream for me. And he said, he told me that I was going to rise to the occasion and be once again the cupbearer in your house, Pharaoh, and all of this sort of thing. And so Joseph comes in and he interprets the dreams for Pharaoh. And the dreams were actually about a famine that was coming in the land. Again, pretty common story. We know this, so we can kind of skim through this. Joseph interprets the dreams, and basically it's about 7 years of plenty that are going to happen. It's going to be quite a bountiful harvest. But after these 7 years of plenty, there's going to be 7 years of famine that are going to begin. And so Pharaoh, he kind of sees what's going on, and he listens to everything that Joseph says. And, Pharaoh says, well, listen, I need somebody to kind of take care of all of this for me. And so that ends up being Joseph, who takes care of the harvest that happens in those first 7 years before the 7 years of famine. And so again, Joseph, rising to the occasion that he's put in, rises to power once again in Egypt, in Pharaoh's house, and was kind of chief of this operation, so to speak, that's going on. And, again, just a testament to how Joseph operated in his life. He kind of put his head down in every situation. We don't see him cry or complain or anything. And it's a very up and down life for Joseph, but he makes the best out of bad situations in almost every aspect of the Bible that we see him in. So, this is kind of where the story gets interesting, right? Because, again, dating all the way back to when Joseph had his first dreams about, his brother's sheaves bowing down to him and the sun, the moon, and the stars and all this sort of thing. This is where a lot of this begins to come to fruition. And, we can kind of skim through most of what's going on here. Jacob sends his other sons to Egypt. Again, there's a famine in the land. They have nothing to eat. So this is kind of the moment when the brothers get to Egypt that Joseph sees them again for the first time. He tests them. He accuses them of, stealing stuff from his house and all of this sort of thing. He's really just trying his brothers. But really deep down, we see as time kind of unfolds that Joseph was waiting for the moment to kind of present himself to his brothers. And one of the coolest things about all of this that goes on is when you turn to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50 kind of lays it out for us as to how everything took place and how Joseph reflects upon it. Genesis chapter 50, verse 19, it says, And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. And, Joseph as a teenager, whatever, when all of these series of events start to take place in his life, I'm sure it's really frustrating. Hard to know what he's thinking, how he's feeling, all of this sort of thing. Again, the word doesn't really give us any enlightenment there. But what we do understand that after everything that Joseph went through, being thrown into the pit, being sold into slavery, then rising to power in Potiphar's house, and then being tempted by Potiphar's wife, and then, her basically accusing him of trying to rape her, being thrown into prison, being made chief of the prison, interpreting dreams once again, still waiting for his 2 dreams to come to pass, but here he's interpreting other people's dreams and seeing their dreams come to pass. I'm sure this is kind of a weird moment for Joseph. But, then on from that moment where he does rise back to power in Egypt, in Pharaoh's house, Pharaoh sets him basically as captain over everything that's going on in the 7 years of plenty, to store all the grain and the corn, all this sort of thing. It's really crazy to think that all of this would not have happened if it wasn't for his brothers, conspiring against him and selling him into slavery, and before that throwing him into the pit. And that's kind of what Joseph outlines here in Genesis chapter 50. We quote this verse at church all the time, going through difficult situations, sickness, struggles, whatever it is. But this is kind of where that originates from. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. I'm sure if you went to a young Joseph and said, Joseph, your life is going to be miserable. It's going to suck at times. You're going to be thrown into prison, all this stuff, accused of raping a woman. But I want you to know that the end result is that you're actually going to save a nation. You're going to save millions of people if you just allow your life to go through that. I'm sure, reluctantly, maybe not fully understanding what he was committing to. I think he would have said, well, if I have to sacrifice my life for the life of, hundreds and thousands and millions, and for my brothers and sisters and all that, he probably would have said yes. Obviously, that isn't laid out before him, but that's essentially what happens in his life. And he, testifies to that because of the action of his brothers selling him into slavery and conspiring against him, yes, they meant it for evil, but God used that terrible situation in the life that he lived to turn it around for the good, to literally save a nation.
Yeah, he was his lifestyle represented like the lifestyle of a servant. He was a servant unto those who didn't have much, those who had way more than everyone else. Like, again, kind of returning to that thought of authority. Like, I don't know, like, he, like, in terms of maybe comparing him, like, people always talk about precursors to Christ, like people who kind of, when you look at them, you can kind of see similarities to Christ, but he had a servant's heart.
Absolutely. Absolutely he did. And, it's just interesting. We can kind of look at this and say, what is the purpose of this story and what we're talking about right now? It's that we don't always understand what the will of God is. Maybe God even gives us little snippets from time to time, or dreams or visions or goals or aspirations as to what we're going to do in life, which was the case for Joseph. He had his dreams when he was just a young man, and they were rejected, and he never knew at what point in his life those dreams would come to fulfillment. But it was years and years and struggle after struggle later that we see that his dreams came to fruition, and the vision that God had for his life and what his life was going to fulfill happened. But it took a long time. So did he walk in the will of God? Absolutely. Was it easy? No. But, really, walking in the will of God shouldn't be easy. There's not many instances where you can see in the Word where somebody walked in the will of God and it was just an easy thing for them to do. If you reflect on the words of Jesus in the New Testament, he said, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. I think if we're walking in the footsteps of God, in the will of God, you're bearing a cross. It's not as easy as just, kind of flying by the seat of your pants and doing what you want to do and going to the school that you want to go to and get the job that you want to do. There's going to be some mountaintop experiences that are really great, but there's also going to be those valleys in your life. But you just have to remember that, whatever you're going through, God's putting you through it for a purpose.
I think that when it comes to trying your best to be a Christian, that's how I'll word it. Because, we're not all the best Christians at every point. Especially when you do have those high moments when your ego might flare up, or when you're having those low moments and you make like Job and curse God sometimes. But I think that like you there's a decision that you have to make, and I've kind of thought about this for a while, where it's like, if you believe that there's a God and that you decide to follow him, your life is not your own. You know what I mean?
Not at all.
And so you need to follow like the will in which the God that you serve, like what his will is. You need to follow his will. But if you don't believe in God and you like, there's no guideline to anything. And so your goal as a Christian is then to follow Christ, because that's the God we believe in.
Absolutely.
And so what does it mean to be a Christian? Obviously is to like, Jesus was a servant even unto death. And Jesus was a servant unto death, and kind of the image that's put with that is the cross. He's bearing the sins of the world, and when God asks that to do, when God asks us to bear the cross daily, it's to try our best to kind of mimic that, and try our best not to sin, but understand that it's a part of us, like dying to ourselves and carrying that burden and like things like that is such a deep thought.
It is, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the key words in what Jesus said is using the word daily, right? I can die for Christ today, but not tomorrow. And really, walking with God and walking in his will and his footsteps is a daily thing. We all have days, I guess, where we would pursue after the flesh or get wrapped up in life or whatever it is. But, he uses that word daily. It's a daily decision to follow after him. You can't commit your life in a moment and just assume that because you committed your life in that moment that you're going to just live strongly for God forever. It's a daily thing. You've got to decide every single day that this is what you want, and it's not about your will, but it's about his will being done. And easier said than done, obviously, at points in life. I'm sure Joseph had those moments where he might have felt like he was in the will of God, waiting for those dreams to come to fruition, but was frustrated in the moment, right? You mentioned Job, and when you read in the book of Job, he's sitting around with his friends, his so-called friends. He's lost everything else. He's lost his family and his wealth and everything that he's got. And, his friends are basically just saying, Job, obviously that you've done something wrong in your life for God to punish you in this way.
Which, in some sense, I think is kind of a fair assumption from them.
Yeah.
Because, I'm not saying that they weren't, awful friends, because they are kind of strange.
No, for sure. But I think what's going on here is that we associate, going through something wrong or going through a hard time in life with God punishing us for the wrongdoing that we've done. Which, don't get me wrong, there's lots of cases in the Bible where, there is a repercussion for the sin that you commit, right? We talk about David committing adultery with Bathsheba. God basically said, David, you've done this, and there's going to be a son that's she's pregnant now. Obviously that didn't come to pass. The child didn't live, but he said, David, because of what you've done, the sword is never going to leave your family forever. So God was just being just in that moment, saying, David, listen, I can't just let you go unpunished for what you did. There has to be a repercussion. There has to be a reaction for the sin that you committed. And there was. God said the sword would never leave his family. But in the instance of Job goes to his friends and he says, guys, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't have sin in my life. He's not saying that he's perfect. That's not what it is at all. But he's just saying, I did not sin, that I have not repented of it already. And so his friends are, basically calling him a liar and saying, well, that's not possible. Why would God do this to you? But the point is that, if we're going through difficult and trying situations in life, which we all do at some point, whether it's when we're young, as we get older, we lose a family member, we lose our health, whatever it is, financial troubles, we all go through stuff in life. But the point is that, those are moments where God is trying us and not just punishing us for sin that we have in our life. And that was the case for Job as well. So
it's almost like it's the only example as well that God, that's the only time we ever get a view of heaven and God making this decision where Job did do nothing wrong. And I think it's almost there, it's almost just there to give us an example, to show us what's kind of going on behind the scenes. But every other example is always just. You have Jonah, who openly denies what God wants and then does his own thing. David, as you said, you Job is pretty much the only example aside from Christ, but Christ was a servant, and Christ voluntarily gave himself, and I mean, Job did he was obviously confused and went through a bunch of emotions. He cursed God 1 second, and then the next second he's thanking God and trusting God. It's a very strange story, but it's I think that's the only example that there is.
Absolutely. And we can even see from the get-go in the mind of God, Job chapter 1 verse 6 is where we can kick off at. It said, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? From Satan. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not made an hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. It's kind of interesting. We can kind of see the mindset of God reflecting about Job and his family. He said, he's a perfect man. He's an upright man. He fears God, and he tries to abstain from evil and all this sort of thing. And, Satan says, well, he only does that because you bless him. But God really says, well, I don't think that's true. I actually think he has all that because he blesses me, right? And, he's got his prosperity and his wealth because he, reverences God and respects God and understands who God is and that God's in control. And that's why Job had his blessings. It wasn't the reciprocal. So
there was I think there comes a point in everyone's life where they kind of do have this Job moment. Like you're studying and you're praying and life's so good and you never feel like you're in such a good place with God, but all of a sudden something goes wrong.
That's the point of taking up your cross daily, right? We can't live our Christian life through peaks and valleys. There's something to be said about stability, and some of the most, I don't want to use the terminology spiritual, but some of the deepest people that I have met and people who love God the most and serve God the most might not be running the aisles on Sunday, which isn't a bad thing whatsoever. We all express our worship differently, but, they're quiet. You would never suspect them to be as solid as they are spiritually, so to speak. But, there's something that is to be said about that level of stability that each and every day, they're in the Word and they're praying rather than going through this kind of peak and valley lifestyle and living for God. You see it a lot with young people as they're trying to find their identity and try to figure out life in the early stages that they're in. They jump from youth event to youth event where they feel like they can take on hell and storm hell after a youth explosion or a youth convention, but then after that, their daily walk struggles. But that's because they were willing in a moment when they were inspired and felt like the Spirit was equipping them to do that. But, you wake up the next morning and it's like, now what, right? Which is, I think we've all been in there at some point in our life. I know I have been when I was younger and even now, right? You go to a great service and you feel the anointing and the blessing of God, and it's kind of like that now what moment. But really, it's that daily walk, right? It's what you do after that moment that really defines how the future is going to unfold.
You can probably agree, especially in these moments where, we're both reading a lot and whatnot. Well, you're reading a lot and I'm trying my best too, but you can probably agree with yourself, maybe, that these moments where you've been reading are probably some of the most inspirational and guiding moments of your life.
Yeah,
maybe.
Absolutely.
And it's more like, I'm not trying to say authentic because most instances of inspiration are authentic, but it's so much more different than just waiting or counting on a special service to happen, where you wake up and you expect the same thing to happen from a service in your daily devotion.
Absolutely. You can compare it to a real life example. That would be like trying to live your life by eating at a buffet once a month and just hoping that you can make it to the next time that you're going to eat. We're talking about feeding ourselves spiritually. So that's basically the exact same thing. It sounds crazy when we think of it in those terms. But, if I said you only have once a month to eat and get full, you would take advantage of that. But that's not the way that we live, right? You're still going to be hungry tomorrow. You're going to desire food tomorrow, no matter how full you are today, right? And so we get so hopped up in a moment of time that I think we lose what comes after that moment, which is that that daily taking up our cross and following after Him.
I think I'll try to share one more story and then we can kind of wrap things up. But I think, like, kind of talking about the cross thing, I dealt with a couple things personally, and I remember that whenever I try to talk about them or something, they would always be somewhat in a somber tone because it's something I went through. But then I remember my mom, she picked me up from a baccalaureate service I had to speak at, and I shared this story, and then she talks to me afterwards, and she tells me, I know what you've dealt with, right? And you can tell yourself that you're not over it or whatever, that you are over it and whatnot. But she told me then that, like, from the way you're talking and the way that you're speaking about the story, you need to look at the more positive side because the emphasis is usually on the negative. And so she told me, like, because it was more about family issues and whatnot. So she told me, what happened is not your fault. This cross is not yours. And I think that's an issue that we have sometimes in the church, especially people who kind of go through family issues or friend issues or something like that, is that we try to carry 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 crosses at the same time. But when when Jesus was holding out the cross, it was 2 arms stretched out. Like you can't put down your cross at any point, because then you're so vulnerable. Like what's going to happen to you? But you can't drop your cross for I'm not trying to say that you're not supposed to help people, because you definitely are. 100%. This is no excuse for that. But you need to be wise about whose cross you're trying to help, because there was one point, I think in Matthew, where Jesus even gets help from someone.
Yep.
Voluntarily. He gets help from someone to carry his cross. So the cross isn't meant to be bared alone. But I'm trying to figure out how to put it. I'm trying to think. Because I'm not trying to say you're not supposed to help anyone. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think we're all supposed to help each other. But, I can only help you, or I can only help somebody to the degree that they're willing to help themselves.
Yes,
right?
yes.
You can look at the example of Jesus. Even Jesus was willing, and he knew it was God's will. It was the will of the Father for him to bear the cross and to suffer on Calvary. So he had accepted that, and he was okay with doing that. But he did have help from somebody. But, had Jesus been trying to walk the opposite direction while that guy was trying to pull his cross to Calvary for him, that's where it becomes a bit of an issue. And, you hear it said all the time, you can only help people to the level that they want to be helped. If you don't want help, or if you are struggling with something and you would rather, live with that struggle or that temptation or whatever you won't let go of, I can't help you beyond that point if you can't help yourself first. I can't make you live for God. I can't make you, forget about the people that have done you wrong if you're not willing to forgive them yourself, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And so, kind of another thing is just to whoever may be listening to this, don't put unnecessary burdens on you, because you can only carry how much you can carry, and God will never put more on you that you can handle. Is that the correct wording?
Yeah, we always say, right? Yeah. God is not going to put more on you than what you are able to sustain and handle on your own. Mm-hmm. Obviously, God saw Joseph as somebody that was very strong, and somebody that was willing to go through a lot to really achieve a lot at the end of his life. When you look at it again, saving literally millions of people because of all the stuff that he had to go through. Mm-hmm. So, and I want to say, just kind of before we go, I know we're going to wrap up here in just a minute. One of the most impacting sermons that I've heard in my life was by Court Chavis, and it was called The Anointing of Frustration. He preached it at Youth Explosion here quite a few years ago. And probably once every year, I actually go back and listen to it. And what it's about is about the life of David, King David, before he is crowned king. And so, he's in the field, and we read about it in Samuel, where the prophet comes to anoint the next king. Saul has kind of lost favor in the eyes of God. God commissions for the anointing of another king. And so we read about this in Samuel, where David is out in the field, and it's the house of Jesse and all this stuff. There's not a lot that I have to add to the story there. We know all about that. But David has this moment in his life where he is anointed to be the next king of Israel. But it didn't happen just in that moment. There was a long period of time that went by before he fulfilled, the purpose and the will that God had for him. And so, David, kind of like Joseph in a sense, had an understanding of what the will of God was for his life, just kind of like Joseph did. Joseph didn't fully understand. He didn't have it laid out for him the same way that David did. Joseph had dreams that he maybe didn't understand the interpretation of exactly, or how those dreams would come to fruition. But David had a pretty easy understanding of what his role was going to be. But the life of David, again, peaks and valleys. You know, it was like really good and really bad. And, you know, he kills Goliath and everybody is, you know, hailing his name in the streets and all of this sort of thing. But then, you know, we've got the reigning king, King Saul, who's trying to kill him, right? And he goes through all of this stuff in his life in the will of God. And he knew it was the will of God because he was anointed to be the next king. And he never lost focus of that, even through all of the stuff, you know, the mess that he had to deal with in his life. He knew that he was fulfilling the will of God, and he was willing to go through some painful times to see that come to fruition in his life.
Perfect. All right. That was, I think that was pretty good. Again, if you feel like anyone needed to hear this podcast, or needs to hear this podcast, share it, give me feedback, and yeah, we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.